Hello, Endeavour here. So tonight I'm here with Morgoth from the YouTube channel Morgoth's Review, a common guest on this channel and a good friend of mine. How are you tonight, Morgoth?
I'm very good, thanks. I was just
common guest on this channel.
That's what I was waiting for.
Yep.
I was hoping you'd carry it over until I had the chance to mute the stream. I'm doing very well, and we're back with another great movie, which I hope people have seen because it is an old one. But at least there's a woman in this one. We've actually got a female character in this one.
the first female character on Morgoth and Endeavor's classic movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got one of them this time. So the film we're going to be reviewing tonight is Once Upon a Time in the West. It's a classic Western film directed by Sergio Leone in 1968. And I'd say it's probably my second favorite Western of all time, next to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which was also by Sergio Leone. Just answering a quick super chat that I got. What's your favorite Leone film? I'd say it's a close call between Once Upon a Time in the West and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Might give it to Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by a slight margin, but this one is a great one too, because this one I think there might be a bit deeper themes to get into. So that's why I thought it would be an interesting film for us to review. So I'll start by giving a short synopsis of the plot of the film. It's not that complex of a plot for anyone who might not have seen it, or maybe you saw it a long time ago, and just as a reminder. So the plot of the film is that there is a murder at a farm. There's a farmer named Mr. McBain, and a ruthless killer named Frank shows up at his farm and kills him and his family. And then later, his newlywed wife, who was not the wife of his kids, he only married her a month ago, arrives in this fictional town called Flagstone, and they take a buggy to this farm to find that the townspeople are there and that her family has been killed. So there's the protagonist of the story is a mysterious, nameless character who is called Harmonica, because his character trait is that he plays a harmonica. That's kind of his what he's known for doing. And he shows up to help Miss McBain, and his real motivation is that he wants revenge on the killer Frank, but it's not revealed till the end of the film really why he hates Frank so much and why he wants revenge on him. Frank frames another bandit named Cheyenne for the murders and tries to pin them on him. And Cheyenne shows up to work with Harmonica to foil Frank's plot to clear his own name. And what's discovered is that there is a railroad tycoon named Morton who wants to build a railway to California. So it's kind of like the railroad across America is reaching the end. They've just about made it all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this plot of land that was owned by Mr. McBain was an essential piece of land because the railroad needed to go through here because it was the only water source for several miles. And McBain had planned on this, and he was going to become a rich landowner from this real estate. And the mogul, tycoon, the railroad tycoon Morton, wants to kill him because he needs that land to get through to the West Coast. So there's a legal struggle over this piece of land throughout the movie. Frank and Morton are trying to get this land. Cheyenne and Harmonica are trying to foil him. And then eventually Frank and Morton break up, have a falling out. Then Morton turns on him. And toward the end, Mrs. McBain is able to hold on to the piece of land, and it's revealed at the very end, once Frank's plan has been spoiled, once Morton is dead, he meets Harmonica for one last showdown when the two have a duel, and it's revealed that his motive was to avenge the death of his brother, who Frank had murdered several years ago and left Harmonica for dead. So not that complex of a plot. It is kind of standard for Western films, but there is a lot of interesting themes in this film, not only about like the Old West, but also just about technology and modernity, and the creep of modernity onto the frontier, onto a more authentic way of life. And I first got the idea of watching this film from Morgoth's blog post that he wrote on it. So I'll hand it over to Morgoth. What would you say you like about this film?
Everything. And this is like, this is like one of my all-time favorite movies, along with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I've watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly more than any other movie, like even more than the Star Wars movies. And I came to Once Upon a Time in the West because when I was young, you see, we didn't have the internet, so I couldn't just like sort of go on Google and find out like the list of all of Sergio Leone's movies. And there was a show on BBC Two, and they used to do cult movies, and I just happened to catch it one night, and this came on, and I was absolutely spellbound because I didn't realize that there was a sort of more serious sequel to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and it had all of the elements there, like the Morricone score, which is even more like, it's kind of nostalgic and emotional in this one than the other one. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is like quite high. In general, everything about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is high energy. Once Upon a Time in the West is very low key. And when I watched it again the last couple, like yesterday, and then I finished watching it again today, but like I've seen it a lot. And one of the things that I noticed is that the music doesn't actually play. There's not as much music in it as you think. And one of the things that Leone's done, like the opening scene of the three men sitting at the train station, like that lasts for 12 minutes, and there's no dialogue, there's no speaking, nothing happens. There's like literally this is how slow it is. The first 12 minutes of the movie are three men sitting at a train station, and but if you listen in the background, there's all kinds of things going on. And it's because Leone's created this soundscape. So you hear like the squeaking of a windmill, and like there's the drop of the hat on Woody Strode's, the big black fella's hat. And then there's another fella like playing around with a fly, and it's really kind of captivating, but you can't quite explain why. And the music actually doesn't kick in until after the slaughter at the McBain mansion. And then it's Frank's sort of motif of the heavy guitar, because each character, this is why it's operatic, because each character has got their own theme. And sometimes it's like a sort of Wagner opera. So if they talk about another character, if there's two characters talking about, say, Frank, you'll actually get a little riff of Frank's theme in the background. So there's just layers and layers and layers of like masterful, absolute masterful filmmaking in Once Upon a Time in the West. And I couldn't really, like, the themes that made us want to do that blog post was, I think I was, 3 years ago that I did that blog post. And I just sat watching it with a few beers one night, and I realized why it's got that sad feeling to it. And it's because it shouldn't really be called Once Upon a Time in the West. It should be called A Farewell to the West, but in a kind of weird way, because they're living before, like you were saying, civilization is arriving in the guise of the railroad, and so the three men in it, basically, they're like coyotes or something. They just really belong on the desert, and it's as if that wildness, like the Wild West, is like on its way out now. And they, like, beyond the normal story, like they all kind of sense that, they all recognize it, which gives it this eerie feeling. I mean, Frank is actually facilitating it because he's Morton's like goon, and he's making sure nothing stands in the way of the railway track.
Yeah, so I'd say that I definitely agree with probably that the cinematography is masterful. The soundtrack is fantastic. One thing I love is the setting. Now, it's shot in Spain, not actually in the Old West, but there is one scene that is shot in Utah in the Monument Valley, and I must say that if there ever is like a whimsical scene in in a serious movie, it's definitely the scene where Miss McBain and this old guy, he's driving her to the Sweetwater Ranch. it's just this fantastic scene where he's just powering along, going super fast on this cart and buggy through the Utah Monument Valley, and the music is this just whimsical score. And there's one thing I noticed in that scene is that he drives through the construction site where they're building the railway, and there's a guy that there's like a railway worker that yells, "Hey, slow down, slow down!" But then the guy is like just yelling, "Yeah, yeah," and the whimsical music just like drowns out the guy yelling at him to slow down. So it's almost like, he just feels like he's so alive in this, in such a majestic environment, and kind of the guy yelling, slow down, slow down. That's kind of like the modern world, just kind of, it's the modern world, just making its way into what was just this untouched, authentic environment before that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The old guy complains as well. He's like sort of shouting abuse at the rail workers, because they are actually laying the railway lines, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't like this intrusion. But then they get to this little tavern, and one of the hallmarks of this is that there isn't really any nice people in the whole movie. So this is where you get to this complete inversion of the Old West. I was doing a bit of research on it, and John Baudrillard, that name's a nightmare for me to say. The postmodern philosopher said that this, Leone making this, was the first postmodern director because he'd taken bits and pieces of all of the classic westerns which he'd loved, and then kind of sort of flipped it and played around with it. So you get the bit in Monument Valley, except this time, you go to this tavern and it's a complete dump, and the bloke behind the bar is this real sleazeball who's trying it on with Jill, and then there's a really high tension scene between Cheyenne and Harmonica, but the landlord, you think they're going to end up shooting each other, and then the landlord says, "Yeah, I just like the nice quiet country life," and yet all we've seen since the movie started, this is a half hour in, all we've seen is death and murders and threats, and then people escaping from prisons, and people being framed for slaughtering families. And this sleazeball tavern keeper is "Yeah, just out here for the quiet country life." And it's all of these little jokes, and it's great. I just love it. I love it so much. Another thing about the layered sound textures when Frank and his heavies go to the McBain house, and there's insects. What do you call them American things? Is it
crickets?
Crickets. It was cicadas or something, or whatever. But yeah, these insects are making a huge chirping noises, and you don't actually notice it. You just think it's part of the background. But then they just stop, and there's just this deadly silence, and it's because Frank's arrived. And then the McBain kind of looks, and then you're conscious that they were there in the first place. And when they go silent, it's really you could cut the tension with a knife, and then they start again, and it's kind of what's going on here? And then they stop again, and then that's when the birds fly, some partridges or something fly up from the bushes, and the firing starts. They shoot the girl. And it's just got so many ways to drag you in and get you engaged in this stuff. It's brilliant. It's really brilliant. I can't praise the movie high enough.
Yeah, when you see at the scene where Frank and his men confront the last McBain boy who just runs out of the house to see his family dead, lying on the ground dead, and the soundtrack is just going absolutely nuts at that point with Frank's theme song. And you can just feel you almost feel like you're that young boy, just staring down the barrel of a revolver of 5 different men. So, it really, the cinematography is just it's 10 out of 10, definitely. And the other thing that is interesting, though, is that the protagonist, Harmonica, he's not really the typical Western protagonist, because usually, and this is something that I've always thought that the Western genre, it's I think an inherently reactionary genre, And the protagonist usually is a all-American hero type, usually played by John Wayne, which he is loyal to his town. He is loyal to his love interest, some beautiful woman out in the Old West who he wins the heart of, and he brings order to the chaos of the Old West. But what you see with Harmonica, and what you see with him, it's kind of this inversion that he's not really invested in anything other than this kind of in getting his revenge on Frank, kind of this unwritten code of honor that the men of the Old West have. That the entire film, like he's not really interested in the town Flagstone or the new town Sweetwater. He says at the end, it'll be a nice town, but he rides off because it's no place that he can live. He's not interested in Mrs. McBain or the money or anything like that. It's really just I mean, he is kind of an anti-hero because it really is just kind of a revenge story, that he is someone who just has this like blood debt against Frank, and that he's determined to get even. But what's also interesting though is that while these guys are brutal, they're definitely ruthless killers. They aren't. I mean, maybe with the exception of Morton, I think that the three main cowboys all have a very strong sense of honor, because with Harmonica, like he helps Frank fight off his own men when they turn on him. When Morton turns Frank's men on him, Harmonica helps Frank kill his own men because he has to be the one to kill Frank himself. But not only does he have to be the one to do that, he has to do it fairly. So you could say, like when they're in the tavern, why doesn't he just shoot Frank in the back of the head? Well, it's because I feel like the sense of honor that they have among these men is that it's like who is the biggest alpha, who is the man who conquers the Wild West the most, and the only way to do that is to actually defeat your opponent in a fair duel. And that's just such an interesting theme, is like this kind of code among men in the Old West, which dies with the arrival of Morton, because he's essentially a scumbag. He doesn't believe in this. He really just believes in money.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Kurosawa thing with it's like the wandering samurai. These sort of they're like, even though like Frank's psychotic and he's a brutal killer, like he's more like the samurai that's gone bad. He's the evil samurai, but he is still a samurai. And you'll notice, like, I mean, there's a lot of men get shot, and there's a lot of shootings and killings in this movie. But you'll notice that the kind of two-bit goons, they're just like cannon fodder. But when it's one of the three, Cheyenne, Harmonica, or Frank, then it is a really big deal when they face off. Whether it's the sort of the tavern scene with Cheyenne and Harmonica, and then there's a couple of interactions with Harmonica and Frank. It's like the full score comes in, and you get the landscape of the face, which is like a typical Leone, like super close up of somebody's face, where you can like see little hairs coming out of the pockmarks and stuff. Another thing is that all of the men, like, I looked it up, and all of them, well, at the time of this was shot, Charles Bronson was in his late 40s. Jason Robards, who was Cheyenne, he was in his late 40s. And Henry Fonda was 64. And this is another thing that Leone does, so everybody looks kind of weathered and worn in. So there's this, that they are like these old, like sort of war dogs of the desert, of the scrub, but they're a rank much higher above the average goons who just get gunned down mercilessly and nobody cares. They're just like background noise.
Yeah, one thing that somebody sent a super chat. If you'd like to super chat, you can send one on Entropy. Links down below. And this is a good point. I was going to bring this up, that Leone cast Henry Fonda as the villain, and I believe that this is the only film he ever played a villain in. And he's considered, Frank in this film is considered one of the best villains ever in a film. And kind of going back to the all-American cowboy archetype, Henry Fonda. When you think of Henry Fonda, you think of the all-American good guy, the guy who's going to, save the day. And this is the only film he's ever played a villain, but he is just one bad motherfucker as a villain, But one thing that, in contrast between Frank and Morton, I will say that Frank, first of all, I wanted to add that Frank has to be the most masculine name ever. I've always thought that a guy named Frank, he's one bad motherfucker you don't want to mess with. Maybe it's from this film, but it seems like his banditry, even though he is a villain, he is a killer, there at least is some kind of honor in his banditry. Like, at least he is like the rough guy who will go out and he'll shoot his enemies. And of course, I mean, we can get into Cheyenne after how the two of them contrast, but with Morton, though, it's like this kind of dishonest banditry. He's just as much of a scumbag. He's just as much of a killer, but at least Frank is honest about it. At least he's the one who will go out and get his hands dirty. But even with Frank, you know, at the end of the film, just like with Harmonica as the protagonist, there's no room for this kind of hitman once the Old West is over, because the weapon of choice for the bandit from then on is not going to be the revolver. It's going to be the dollar.
Yeah. And there's quite a few interactions between Frank and Morton. And Frank's on this doomed story arc where he actually tries to become like Morton, but then he realizes at the end of the day he is what he is. And he says to at the final face-off with Charles Bronson, Charles Bronson says, "So you finally found out what you really are, that you're not like Morton." And what he means is, like, you're not like these new wave of businessmen and bankers and merchants who are coming in. And Frank acknowledges it and says, "Just a man." I mean, the dialogue's always sparse, but it's loaded with like a lot of meaning. You see in the scene as well where Morton pays Frank's men to shoot Frank, and so Charles Bronson helps Frank. But you also notice that even though Frank has been betrayed and he's surrounded and is on his own, like he doesn't panic. He's not like a sort of cowardly villain which runs away. He's like, yeah, okay, I'm completely on my own, but I'm still going to shoot my way out of this. And he does as well. And then he looks up to Charles Bronson as if to say, like, what is going on with you? And then he heads back to Morton. I mean, to be fair, Morton does have his own story where, because he's crippled, he can't actually, he wants to get to the warm waters of California. That's like his drive. And the only way he can get there, because the railroad doesn't exist, so he has to build it. And and he keeps looking at that map of the ocean on his carriage, and it's like his dream is to get to the warm waters of California, where presumably he can like sort of sit in the sea all day to rest his rickety bones. But then when I think it was cut because the film's long enough, but Cheyenne's men like basically kill the last of Frank's men and mortally wound Morton. And you see him crawling, and he ends up like face down in a muddy puddle. And then so Leone brings in the sound of the lapping waves, as if to say, like, that's as far as he's going to get. Like, this is what you're going to get instead of the warm seas of California, is just this little muddy puddle in the desert. And Frank is going to shoot him, but it dawns on him, like, just how far he's fallen. So he puts his gun away and just leaves him to slowly die in the puddle. It's like, oh, he's like, such a bastard. You've just gotta admire it. That's
we got to mention that Morton actually has tuberculosis, and one important thing about his character is that he can't walk without crutches, and even then he can just barely move. And you know, Frank he mocks him in one scene by saying that outside of that rail carriage, he's like a turtle outside of his shell. And the quote you mentioned at the end, where Frank says, where Harmonica says, "You found out you're not a businessman after all," and Frank just says, "I'm just a man." Bronson, Harmonica replies, "An ancient race, other Mortons will be along to and they'll kill it off." So you know, what Morton is bringing, this modernity that Morton is bringing, this the way of life, both with the technology that, you know, someone like Morton, who is physically weak and mentally weak as well, before the late 19th century, he could never get to California, because a lot of people might not realize this, but in the Old West, before there was a railroad, crossing from East Coast to West in America had like a 10% chance of death. It was not something for the faint of heart, and it was only a frontier that people like people like Frank, Harmonica, and Cheyenne could conquer. But with Morton comes like this a lot like more soft and weak kind of society, and what Frank is implying is that it kills masculinity. It kills off real men.
Yeah, and the big winners in all of this are a woman, and like I mean, Morton dies, but like there will be more Mortons along. The trade has arrived at Sweetwater by the end of the movie, so the civilization has arrived, and the big winners are going to be Jill, Claudia Cardinal, who we didn't mention yet, but is a great character in this, and then Morton himself. And of the three kind of old coyotes, two of them are dead and one of them's lost. When Bronson leaves at the end, I mean, this is just something I did a bit of research on this yesterday, so it isn't. I didn't notice all of these things, but it's interesting to steal other people's takes and pass them off as my own on the stream. But one of the things that at the end, another homage, is when Charles Bronson leaves at the end, he kind of looks out the doorway and he just looks across the sort of the wilderness, but there's workers there. And Jill says, like, will you return? And then he just says, maybe someday, and then wanders off. Now that's actually from The Searchers, where John Wayne, you've had this huge, and it's in Monument Valley as well, I think, where you've had this huge saga play out. But John Wayne, like, he understands that his place isn't sitting by the fire, wrapped up in a blanket. Like, in the end of the day, he belongs out with the wild, with the coyotes and with the wilderness and with the cactuses and with the muddy puddles and all. So his spirit belongs out in the wilderness. And Charles Bronson is doing the same thing. So again, it's like Leone giving a nod and a wink to these older classic westerns, which he's kind of subverting, because his incarnation of the West is much more brutal and savage than theirs, and it's almost like a debunking of the, and that's why you've got Henry Fonda turning up as like the worst villain in all of Western history, maybe. And another thing that Leone said, when Fonda turned up for there wasn't no audition, he just got the part. He was a big star, but he turned up and he had like this little sort of like the normal standard evil beard, pointy beard, and he had like brown contact lenses in to make his eyes look dark. And Leone said, "No, get rid of that. Just get rid of that. I want Henry Fonda, and I want your eyes," because he had really deep blue eyes. And he said, "I want your eyes on, and I'm even going to enhance them." And then when you see the massacre at the beginning, the camera pans in a certain way where if you are in the audience and you didn't know about the movie, like you've just seen like this shocking slaughter of a family and even children, a little girl, two boys. And then when the camera pans round and you see who's actually done it, it's Henry Fonda standing there. So in 1969, that would have been like a shock to the system, and people would be thinking, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, his eyes just stare like right deep into your soul. The other character, and I think that of the three, he might be my favorite, is Cheyenne. Now, while Frank is kind of the bad bandit, Cheyenne, he's another bandit. He's a gangster and he's a killer too, but he's kind of the good bandit. And I find that maybe he might actually be morally superior to Harmonica in some ways, because with Harmonica, it is really, I find like his motivation is just his revenge against Frank. But with Cheyenne, he actually does seem to have like a moral code of right and wrong. And a lot of his actions are actually motivated by that. So, yeah, for example, when he gets to the Sweetwater Ranch and confronts Jill, he says, I've killed people before, but never children. That's like beyond the pale for him. So he'll kill you, but he definitely won't kill kids, and that's like beyond his that's like outside of the code of honor, which is why all these guys are outlaws, bandits and stuff. But I guess that's what makes Cheyenne the good kind of bandit, and Frank the bad kind, if that's even possible. And I will point out here that it actually did challenge me on my thesis in the Public Enemy video, because I had to admit I found Cheyenne very sympathetic, and I actually really liked him as a character. He's reminiscent of, if you've played the game Red Dead Redemption, I have to think that this game was largely inspired by Once Upon a Time in the West. He reminds me of John Marston from the game, because he is he's a career criminal, a bandit, but at the same time he is a gentleman. And like toward the end of the film, there's a deal in the contract for the land that if the station is not built by the time the railroad reaches Sweetwater, the McBains will surrender the rights to the land, and it will be repossession. That's why Morton and Frank wanted to kill them. It was so that they could claim the land when the railroad arrived. Cheyenne has his men help build the station because and it's because it's just to help Miss McBain, because he believes it's the morally right thing to do. So, I guess my take on him is that like the Old West was the only time that, kind of the only place ever that Cheyenne could in some way be a good man. And, he dies of his wounds at the end. And, with him, I guess he has no place in the coming society, because he couldn't be somewhat of a good man in that new one.
Yeah, he's definitely the warmest of the characters. But in the interaction with when he goes along to the first sort of encounter with Jill, when he's being framed for the massacre, he's actually really cold with Jill at first, and then like he's basically kind of being a little bit intimidating. And then Jill says, "Look, at the end of the day, you can throw me over the table and like rape me, bring your men in and they can rape me as well. Have their way with me." And all that means to me is that I'll just have to take a long bath. Like I've had it all before. Like so Cheyenne actually begins to like her more after she comes out with that. And it's because what he understands is that in the world where they are, like they're all broken. Like the harshness of this world, there's no ideals here. And again, like, so, he actually likes the fact, and he says like his mother was like the biggest whore, and I don't know what the town was called, and that his dad, but she was a great woman, and that his dad, whoever he was, for an hour or for a month, he would have appreciated her as well. And so like, so in this world, like, it isn't an idealized world. They're all broken because of the harshness of it all. And so he actually appreciates her more, because it's like, yeah, she's been through the grinder as well. She's a battered and scarred person as well, just like all of the rest of them are.
Yeah, because McBain had met her in Louisiana, so she was not of the Old West. She was a new arrival there. And he had only married her 1 month earlier and then promised her to come to the land. And he said he was rich, which wasn't true, because the station had not been built yet. The railroad was not there yet. So she basically arrives at this ranch with her newlywed husband and his kids, but not her kids, lying dead on the table, who she had never even met. And she's completely alone in this completely alien environment to her. So, and in many ways, I think she is one of the one character that actually will survive post into the new modern West that's arriving. But one quote I took from Red Dead Redemption, because this I thought just summed up Cheyenne a lot, is that in the game there's a character named Irish. He's an Irishman, and he says to John Marston, "You're an angry and fuck ugly man, but not a bad one." And I thought that definitely sums up Cheyenne in this film. Yeah,
that is. He is the sort of the warmest of the characters, though it takes a while until you suss it out. I mean, when I did the blog post as well, so the general gist of the blog post was that I did kind of lament that I used words like, this is the beginning where people are going to end up in pods eating like maggot burgers or whatever. Like, this is the beginning of the pause. And I got a little bit of pushback on that, because when we think about the West, I mean, this opens up like a can of worms. But when we think about the West, that you can contrast this world of Sergio Leone, which is like Once Upon a Time in the West, is it writ large, but he played around with it in his other movies as well. But when you contrast it with the John Wayne, I mean, you know, there wouldn't be a prostitute like Jill in the John Wayne movie. You tend to get like a sort of prissy school mom who he kind of has the hots for, but he's very gentlemanly and all of this. Whereas when you look at Once Upon a Time in the West, there's a scene like when Frank's on top of Jill on the bed, and he's sort of, it looks like he's just raped her or something, or he's going to, and then the camera pans in, and you see like you see all of these like long, straggly, thick grey hairs coming out of his back and his shoulders, and then she's like really pretty and young, and you think, God Almighty, like this is really bad, like, and he's like such an animal. And then, but you wouldn't get any of that in the John Wayne. So in the John Wayne, you can understand why the John Wayne archetype became an American icon, and so Leone's kind of subverting that. He's kind of saying, actually, no, I'm not going with it. And so it is a subversive movie. But the thing is, if you look at the John Wayne sort of patriarchy, I mean, he's kind of like Donald Trump type figure that America seems to throw out, these larger than life kind of big old bruiser types, and it is being independent and hardworking and a good Christian and all of this. Well, the thing is, what Leone seems to be saying is that, well, yeah, but that was the beginning of the end of the Old West. That was the civilizing process which kind of cooked everything. And when I did my blog post, I got a little bit of like feedback, and a couple of people were reacting and saying, I think you've gone too far, because it was as if I'd kind of looked at it Once Upon a Time in the West through such a reactionary lens that I was kind of taking the side of this primitive anarchy over like the civilization that was coming in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because that is actually something that that's something I'm really torn on over, because I do feel like, well, one thing I have great admiration for is, and I know that according to Microsoft Word, this isn't a real word, but I feel like what if I had to pick one word, which isn't a real word, to sum up the North American European spirit, it would be frontiersmanship. Now, apparently that's not a real word, but I think we really ought to make that a real word, because I think that just such a strong part of both American and Canadian identity is just conquering this massive wilderness, this brutal frontier. And, the guys that go out are the rough guys. It's the Lewis and Clarks, the explorers. And I think that is something very noble, bringing civilization to a wilderness, to this frontier is, in my opinion, something that I have great admiration for. However, I do think that, once that comes to an end, you can only go so far. And once that comes to an end, that's when the Mortons come. That's when the Mortons come in afterwards. So, I struggle to say that, it's bad to conquer land, because, I think North America, that's how European civilization expanded there. It's through conquest, it's through frontiersmanship, it's through colonialism. But then I also have to Leone, because like a good film, for example, is How the West Was Won, and it has the opposite message of Once Upon a Time in the West. And I like both, but this one is a celebration of the final conquest of the West. The film ends with highways and skyscrapers, and it's like a triumphant song, like we won this land valiantly. And I do agree with that. But then when you see the giant skyscrapers, that is that is the arrival of modernity. That is the death of the frontiersman spirit, really. And I don't know really what the answer is. I was trying to think of it today. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you have this frontiersman spirit, which I think that, the cowboy, the reason that it's such a great archetype is that it's the perfect embodiment of the frontiersman. How do you round that with the fact that once he reaches the end, then then, you know, his archetype dies, the frontiersman spirit dies. And the answer I think I came to is eventually you will need to have a new frontier, because like what Leone, I think, suggests at the end of the film, that it's inevitable that, you know, there might be this Wild West that is free and majestic, and there might be living a more masculine, more authentic way of life. But I think he does suggest that the end is kind of inevitable. And I think the answer I came to is that you'll need a new frontier after that.
Yeah. That's the only thing you can do, is to keep going and keep expanding out into the endless space. But I mean, if it boils down to it, would you rather live? Because the interesting thing is, in 1969, when this came out, there was actually a lot of westerns, a lot of classic westerns came out. True Grit came out the same year in America, and so did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which is a much more like left liberal film than this, which is a lot, you know, it's a lot gentler and has a much more playful spirit to it. But I cannot, you know, when you look at the town and where this is set and how brutal it is, like, I wouldn't want to live there. I don't want to be like the second goon on the left who gets casually shot by Frank because he doesn't look like the way I smile or something. So I get a bullet put in me gut. Where under like John Wayne's patriarchy, at least you can actually have a civilization. Do you know what I mean? So I can kind of get on board with the criticisms of my blog post. Maybe I did get a bit carried away, but nevertheless, these things are processes that just keep going on. But if I could choose, I would like prefer to bring up a family with John Wayne down the road than Frank's gang. And what makes me laugh, you know, is that you see these all these different political groups on the internet. And one of them, you'll get like anarchists. I've always been baffled by anarchists. And when I look at Once Upon a Time in the West, like, I think that is it. That is what anarchy would actually be like. It wouldn't be like this sort of communistic thing where everybody's like trading turnips and carrots. It would just be like men like Frank come along and shoot you in the gut because they don't like the way you look. They do. I mean, there's loads of great lines on it. I saw before in the chat that somebody was saying about you brought too many, the horses. But at the start of the movie, and there's the face-off after the 10 minutes at the train station, 10 minutes of atmosphere building, 10 minutes of atmosphere building, and then Charles Bronson says, "Did you bring me a horse?" And the three Frank's men turn around and they've only got three, and there's three of them. They said, "Looks like we're shy one horse." And then he just shakes his head and says, "You brought too many." And then that's when it's like, okay, it's going to kick off. But my favorite line of the whole movie is when there's that kind of snitch called Wobbles, and it's this fat, lardy, ugly little piece of shit. And he wears a belt and he wears suspenders, and he's trying to double cross people, and he's always getting slapped around and kicked around by like the three hard men. But eventually, like, Frank realizes that he's led somebody to him. So Frank kicks him off the train, and he's looking down on him on the desert. And he says, "How can you trust a man who wears a belt and suspenders? Like, this man cannot even trust his own trousers." And he shoots him in the belt buckle, which goes straight into his gut. And then he shoots both of his suspenders as well and just leaves him to die in the desert. Like, they're just death by insult.
Yeah, I just love in that scene because Harmonica was on top of the train, and this fat character, he said to Frank, no one followed me, but Frank sees Harmonica's shadow, so he catches him when he's trying to come down. But when he kicks the fat guy off the train, he looks up and he sees Cheyenne is underneath the train, and then he's like, "Frank!" And then Frank just shoots him, and Cheyenne's like, "Shh, shh," and then "I told you to be quiet." It's just some great dialogue. But one thing I noticed about the opening film, and I think that this was kind of a clever thing that Sergio Leone threw in there with kind of his critique of the Western genre, kind of the subversion of the Western genre. And he'd even use this same cliche in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's the famous cliche of the hero facing off against three bad guys, and he shoots all three of them at once. That happens in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I'm sure several other Western films. That happens in this one too, but one of the guys, with the last one, gets hit, but he gets a shot off, and he hits Harmonica in the shoulder while he's falling to the ground, and actually wounds him. So I don't know. I think it's kind of like Sergio Leone's way of just kind of knocking the cowboy archetype down a peg. I mean, because Harmonica is a critique of that character, and it is kind of it's subtle, but it's just like fascinating how he gets hit in the shoulders. Like, okay, he's good, but he's not that good.
And the three men at the beginning, I'm not sure. One of them is from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's the one in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He gets shot by the Ugly at the beginning of the movie. And then much, much later, which is like 9 months in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he comes back, but he's only got one arm. And he catches the Ugly in a bath, and the Ugly just shoots him again. And he kind of comes in. I know it's a different movie, but he comes into the bar where the Ugly's having a bath. And he rambles on, and he says, like, you son of a bitch, I've spent 9 months tracking you down, and now I've got you right where I want you. Finally, finally. And then the Ugly just shoots him. And he says, when you got to shoot, shoot, don't talk. And then you get like the kind of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly kind of scream thing coming in. And on this one, he gets shot at the start again, the same bloke. He's like, his whole career was just getting shot in Sergio Leone movies. And then that's his resume. And then the other one, though, the kind of the bloke with the bong eye who plays around with the fly, that's Jack Elam. And he, I mean, in that same year, he would have been in True Grit, and he's what a character actor who popped up in all of these other like Western. Usually, he's the second goon from the left, or maybe some cantankerous old fart sitting outside of a mine or something like that. Well, and then the other one, the big black fella, he'd popped up in other classic Westerns as well. So Leone, again, he's having his little bit of fun here and bringing them in to be shot. But rumor has it that he actually wanted Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach to be the three at the start, but they turned it down. And I think he originally wanted Clint Eastwood to be Harmonica's role maybe as well, but he didn't get that either. At that point, Eastwood had enough of the spaghetti westerns.
Yeah, that might if he had Lee Van Cleef, Clint Eastwood, and Eli Wallach be the three guys that got shot, that might have been a bit too bold in my opinion. That's kind of like, okay, we can play around with this, but let's not go too far.
Yeah.
That might have been. I can see why they turned that down. But I guess like the question though, in regards to who would you rather live next to, would it be the John Wayne or Frank's gang? It's obviously John Wayne, but I guess one of the questions is who would you rather be? Would you rather be Cheyenne, Harmonica, or Frank, or would you rather be Morton? And I'd say you'd rather be one of the three, because what I thought of with Morton is that he's almost like the 19th century version of the San Francisco bug man who works for Google or something like that. I mean, he's physically weak, but he's also extremely materialistic, selfish, and he's just like so disconnected from a natural, authentic way of life. He's basically surrendered all of his masculinity for material comfort. Morton spends almost the entire film inside of this carriage. I guess this could be like his version of the pod or the San Francisco flat or something like that. It's almost like he might be rich, he might be powerful, but is he really even a man anymore? And I don't think he is. He is kind of like one of these modern bugman.
He gets Cheyenne compares him to a slug as well, because you can find out where a slug's been because it leaves like a kind of fluid trail behind it. And from his perspective, like that's what Morton is. He doesn't even need to like take him prisoner or hostage or anything. He can find him whenever he wants by just following the train line. And then you've got Frank. Morton like hobbles his way to Frank's hideout. Like Frank like lives in a cave on the side of a cliff, and that's his hideout. and then he kicks the crutches away from him, and he says, "I could squash you like a wormy apple." And the Morton's on the ground, like just sort of begging for mercy. But he does say, like, he looks at Frank's gun and he says the one thing that can stop that is this, and he pulls out a big load of notes. And this is the real problem that they're facing. And eventually, of course, he's going to turn Frank's men on him as well.
Yeah, and the film does suggest that the dollar is more mighty than the revolver in the end, because he is able to turn his men against him.
Yeah.
I guess another thing that was on my mind was that because I was thinking about the essay that was written by Sir John Bagot Glubb about Fate of Empires, the essay titled Fate of Empires, which is similar to Oswald Spengler, which unfortunately I have not gotten around to reading yet, but I think I will eventually. And I think that, when it comes to the American empire, it certainly didn't begin to decline like we are seeing today. I don't think that happened until maybe the mid to late 20th century. But I mean, could it? Because John Bagot Glubb talks about the cycle of empires going from kind of a spiritual entity, from it being something that men feel a great sense of duty towards and honor, and that they feel like they're in it for this great spiritual cause. Was the conquest of the final frontier? Was that the transition from America as a more spiritual empire towards a commercial empire? Because he talks about, once they've kind of reached the top, it goes from being a sense of duty and a sense of civilizational achievement to really just being about making more money and it being a commercial venture rather than a civilizational one. And I have to think that, maybe in America that might have been, I don't want to say like that's the beginning of America's decline, because I don't think that's definitely not true, but maybe it could have been the beginning of the end for it.
Well, I think it was written into the coding of America right from the start. But I think when we're talking about anarchy as well, like the sort of the how primitive and brutal it is in the West in Leone's movies. I actually don't think it would have been that bad in real life. I read somewhere that the amount of people being shot, like there's probably more people shot in this movie than like all over America or that year or something. I think it was mainly the sort of very Christian conservative people trying to set up shop. And I can also see where that libertarian leave me alone kind of mentality comes into it. But the thing is, leaving aside the Indians, it was just empty open space which was there for the taking. So you can see that. But the difference is in Europe, it was settled for thousands of years. So this whole question is unique to America. It doesn't really apply to Europe at all. But when I say that it was coded into the DNA, it's because America did have sort of inherited a lot of mid-civilizational baggage from Europe, which was liberalism. And if you look at when they go out onto the desert and plant their flag, let's say, if you look at McBain and what McBain was trying to do there, I think this is like the argument I would use. So McBain, he's actually trying to live genuinely the American dream. So he goes out into the desert and everybody thinks he's crazy because nobody understands it. But what he's actually doing is buying up a piece of land with water on it because he knows that sooner or later, and it's probably going to be later, that the train tracks will actually go straight through his land because he's bought up this piece of scrub in the middle of nowhere, but it's got the only fresh water supply for 50 square miles or something like that. So eventually, let's just leave Morton and Frank and the storyline to one side. Let's just assume that McBain actually succeeded in doing that. So he'd also ordered like loads of wood and nails, enough to build a small town. That's what it's all about. So then McBain would have actually been the owner of a whole town that he built. So he would have like, I don't know, property rights and all this kind of thing. But basically, he would have been like a magnate. He would have been a multi-millionaire who had founded a town and could prosper from it. He'd have probably been in charge of the bank and everything. And then you can think, well, so that actually already straight away puts him in a very powerful position. And then you also, if we look at Morton, who's trying to go all the way through this train line, it can be that he then signs a partnership deal with McBain that he can then stop off there and use the water to create more steam for the train, and then also begin investing in that area. And all of a sudden, you've got like the McBain and Morton Corporation or Foundation. You've got the beginning of a multinational or some kind of super powerful economic entity, and it isn't planned. It isn't a conspiracy. It's just the way things were in America at that time. And then you can push it further down the road, and you can say, well, actually, the wages are getting a little bit too high. We need to ship some Mexicans in here to try and push the cost of labor down a bit. You can see I would say how this is actually a natural thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's because kind of the free market capitalism that's kind of built into America's founding. It does really lend itself to, I guess, the development of modernity in many ways. Because with what's his name, Mr. McBain, he planned that ahead of time. He thought like it was what was going to make him a millionaire. And yeah, I mean, is there a way to stop that though? I wonder.
I don't know, actually. I mean, I can certainly the problem with that as well is that so initially you get the people going out and because you would be if you buy like a big ranch out there, you would be like your own a baron, a cattle baron. They call you'd be like some medieval lord, because you just need to keep the government off your back. But the problem is the process of this, the process of capital, means that you are also at the same time bringing civilization with you. So then the problem becomes that you're not going to be left alone anymore. You are linked to it. The more successful you are, the more you come into contact with the forces of civilization. So then it's like, how independent can you actually be?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's a difficult question, with the you have the Wild West, these empty deserts, but then when civilization gets in there, then eventually you are going to get that. I think maybe it's a really hard question to answer, but I would say that I would say just in moderation. I think it is largely inevitable. I don't want to go too far into. I don't want to delve too far reactionary that we can't even have running water or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just like how do you cope with it? Because I think that is kind of the burning question today. Because I don't think anytime soon, barring some catastrophe, I don't think we're going to go back to having these ranches like out in the West and stuff, like in the Old West and stuff like that. I don't think we're going to regain that anytime soon. I think the burning question would be how can you handle that? How can you confront those forces and still maintain a authentic spiritual life without capital taking over it all, and without it being all spoiled, without it becoming globo homo. Yeah, and I think that is the burning question, really, because that is, I think, in the modern day what we're really going to need to answer.
And the funny thing is, it's also like specifically American, or at least Anglo. It's something in the Anglo world, because I mean, Russia is a country. I know it's got a bit of a rocky history. But Russia is a country which has huge open expanses, and people can make money. Why did that not happen in Russia? Or, well, you know, there was other things happened in Russia which were even worse, if we're honest about it. But still, you can have a more traditional life out there in Russia. So it's as if they just don't have that like spirit or something. I don't know. I'll have to think about that some more.
Yeah, I think it could have a lot to do with just Anglo-liberalism and kind of the empiricism and a lot of the ideas that came in through the Enlightenment that they are very I mean, the problem with kind of the Anglo-empiricism, and I made a video about this, is that it kind of prevents you from, when you rationalize all of it, it prevents you from actually having actually appreciating anything for itself. And I think that maybe that is kind of one of America's Achilles heels. You know, someone can look at the Monument Valley or something like that, and you know, according to this kind of understanding of the world, why not build a Walmart there, or why not you know, have a city that has like a mosque and an LGBT pride parade there? Well, you know, you need to have something that goes beyond, you need to have a conception of value that goes beyond the material to say, no, this valley is really just something majestic. And I must say, if there's anywhere, if I could live in one place in America, it'd be Utah. I want to see Utah before I die. But you have to have like some kind of worldview that tells you that, well, you know, this way of life. And, you know, I do have a big appreciation for the American dream, kind of like out west way of life, you know, buying a farm, having your family there. My great grandfather was a farmer out in Saskatchewan. He had 11 kids. He died when he was 38 years old during the Great Depression. You know, not an easy life, but that is something that I have always had a great appreciation for. But how do you have that without it it becoming?
I think that the trick would be where you've got to have. Another thing is that you're also talking mainly about Protestants and parts like Christians who are actually incentivized in that way. And also you could say that if, let's say, to go back to the Once Upon a Time in the West scenario, if McBain, he would have to be in a situation where he was in opposition to Morton, but then he's going to have to try and justify that by saying, I like the area the way it is, we like our way of life here, or something like that. But then the problem is there twofold. One is there's always the drive towards more. So he maybe have $2 million from creating Sweetwater, but then a partnership with Morton would offer him, say, an extra $3 million in his bank account. So there's always this drive towards more material wealth on the part of just how this works. On the other, but if it was a more traditional, maybe if it was like, you know, you had like in the medieval ages and a local lord or a baron or something may well just tell him to get lost, and he'd actually have the manpower to stop him bringing the train line through in the first place, because that's another thing. Of course, it was all quite corrupt. I mean, he did have goons going out and killing people who were standing in the way. That's what Frank was.
Yeah, I think ultimately, though, I guess that it would be the problem is liberalism, and the problem is the empirical worldview that judges everything by numbers on a graph. I think you need something religious that goes beyond that to actually prevent what is like, you know, what is a venture which I have great admiration for. How to prevent that from becoming that commercial soulless empire with, you know, global home of McDonald's Corp. I think it requires religion. I think it requires it to be a spiritual venture first and foremost, and a commercial one second.
I mean, it's interesting because, okay, if I in that blog post that I did, and I was kind of given this romantic description of like the genuine Wild West of these hard men, but then like the sort of the standard like right wing talking point is the trad thing. It's like the 1950s, but by the time we get to the 1950s, we're already well away from, say, even the John Wayne kind of world. Do you know what I mean? Like even like because then you've got the housewife, and it's the washing machine as a brand. They've got the Bernays style propaganda brainwashing, which makes them want things that they never even knew they wanted, and it tricks them into wanting things. Because in the end, you can really see how Morton would hire someone like Edward Bernays to trick people into thinking, well, how can we expand the market for cigarettes? Especially, why don't women smoke? And it's like, oh, well, it's socially taboo because everybody's too conservative. And that'll be like, okay, well, we need to break down those taboos, and we also need to find a way that women can smoke, make it rebellious or something, make it look like they're being independent, because we can double the market. Do you see what I mean? We're already well on the way there. But and you can see that it would be the Morton archetype who would do that, but it wouldn't be the McBain. McBain is more, I think, of the libertarian the libertarian ideal than Morton. The problem is the Morton types, really.
Yeah. I mean, I always wondered to what extent is the Wild West genre libertarian? I think it's libertarian in the sense that there isn't government control there, but that's just because it just is not possible. They haven't had that amount of infrastructure. They don't have that amount of infrastructure yet to really have a big state. But I think that it's not really libertine, so to say. So, the guy saying that, the libertarian cringe today that we've all had enough of, I want the gay couple to guard their weed farm with their guns and stuff like that. This is would never exist in the Old West. It's strongly conservative. Like, you can even see this with McBain at the beginning. And I thought that was really interesting, just seeing like a couple minutes of his family, like with his son going off to pick up his wife. He chews his son out because his boots are dirty and that he's late, and that he says she's not his mother, and he smacks him in the face. I mean, way to spend the last minute with your last living minutes with your son. But of course, he didn't know he was going to die. But you definitely see, and then his daughter has like this nice long dress on, and she's preparing the meal. You definitely see the traditionalism in the McBain family, and I think that the Old West definitely would have had a large amount of traditionalism. I don't know if it actually would have been just prostitutes and bandits everywhere. I kind of think that maybe the portrayal of the McBains might have been a more accurate portrayal than that of Frank, Harmonica, and Cheyenne, because when you exist in a desolate, uncivilized land, think of the Puritans, think of the Afrikaners going out into South Africa. You have to have social conservatism. It seems that environment breeds a very hierarchical, conservative, religious way of life in a way that libertarians, at least most of the mainstream ones, do not envision their ideology today.
Yeah, it's John Locke. It's that Lockean thing. The problem is it sort of presupposes some from the 17th century, some very, very heavy Christian influences. So it comes in sort of with that as a default mode. And the problem is when as you kind of move on, the other liberties that it allows, let's say like free speech, that also allows then people to undermine the Christian foundations. So it ends up where you've got one set of the liberties ends up dissolving the values of the other set of the liberties, or at least the glue that was holding it all together. And what happens is that it tends towards degeneracy then. And so the sort of, you end up where, like I've said before, it's like a body doesn't have any bones anymore. It doesn't have that thing that was propping it up. It's just empty and vacuous. It's just a sort of abstract set of rights, which in all fairness, that isn't the problem in Once Upon a Time in the West. And it wasn't even a problem when they were making Once Upon a Time in the West. You could say that, 1969, yeah, so it had just started really kicking in. So it isn't, the kind of social conservatism isn't really an issue at all. In that, you've always had prostitutes, but they were looked down upon. They weren't like earning $20,000 a month on OnlyFans and having their dad be proud of it or whatever. Like Jill, it is a slur on Jill that she's a whore.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like the entire genre of the West and this entire environment presupposes social conservatism because, like, let's face it, some transgendered, fat, lesbian, feminist wouldn't survive 2 days out in the West. You know, they'd be they'd be bitten by a rattlesnake in 10 minutes and fall over dead. You just couldn't have these, like, you know, these socially liberal phenomenons like feminism, LGBT agenda, and stuff like that, because a lot of that requires a certain amount of material wealth. It requires material decadence, really. You know, like even like the character of Morton kind of shows us that he is a very weak man, but kind of the technology, the railroad, is what allows him to make that trek out to California, which no cripple ever could have made prior to the late 19th century with the railroad.
I mean, one of the pushbacks as well that I got was when I sort of lionized the three men in the movie, was that, well, you can't actually build a civilization around that kind of man, which I think is another interesting kind of, it's related to what we're talking about here. But when you look at it, like they don't. I mean, even Morton or McBain, and definitely a John Wayne archetype, more, you can build a civilization with men like that. But if you're honest about it, do either Frank, Cheyenne, or Harmonica like actually contribute really to like civilization and create? They don't. They're more like parasites. They're predators on, and the people are like weak. So again, you can see from the perspective of the people, like you want some more law and order around, because there doesn't seem to be any law and order at all. They're just wandering around shooting people in broad daylight. And then they've got like this shambles of a court where it's like this auction thing going on. It's pathetic. I mean, if I was just a normal farmer or some stable hand going around that, I'd be terrified. They're just wandering around shooting people in broad daylight. Like they're not actually conducive to any kind of civilization. And then, if anything, they're standing in the way of it. So you can, and this is to get back to the John Wayne archetype. If you look at True Grit, which came out in the same year, so that in that case you do have like a sort of old, rough alpha male. And in True Grit, the problem with in True Grit is interesting because they're complaining that Rooster Cogburn actually shoots too many bad guys. Like, he doesn't have time for all the bureaucracy and all of the sort of the laws and all of the lawyers. He thinks this is all bullshit. And he's got like 19 kills under his... And there's this funny scene in the courtroom where he kills like 3 brothers. And he tells this tall tale, and it doesn't make any sense. And it's implied that he's just sort of snuck up on them. They were killers, but it's implied that he kind of snuck up on them in the middle of the night and shot them in their beds. And it's like, oh well, he reached for the poker and all of this kind of nonsense. But yeah, so you got to say, well, I can at least side with the John Wayne type there, like. That's actually more conducive to civilization. All of a sudden, in the John Wayne movies, the sort of the main characters in Once Upon a Time in the West are the goons that John Wayne shoots. But in what Sergio Leone's done is kind of amplify them and make them look like these, like I said earlier, this samurai wandering the wasteland. And I still say that there is something to be said for that, because, like, leaving aside the wider civilizational sort of dilemmas here, like, there's something to be said for a world in which a man can actually live like a wild life like that, where you could, like what we were saying earlier about these higher ideals, where you can you can actually be the wandering warrior without being bound to like tax cuts and parking spaces and all of this stuff. Like that's the real like sadness. It isn't so much that these men in particular are gone, but that spirit is being like purged. And yet in another Hollywood movie which John Wayne won an Oscar for, it's kind of like, yeah, it's a great thing that it was purged.
Yeah. The thesis I actually had in the Public Enemy video was that, you know, the scoundrel, the hoodlum, is an enemy of civilization. He's not pro-civilization. But I mean, you know, I am happy with films that do challenge my views. But yeah, definitely, I would think that the John Wayne type is more pro-civilization. You know, in the standard Western film, the archetype of the sheriff, you know, the sheriff is a force of civilization because he is bringing law and order to a land that is wild, as in the Wild West. He is a force for order in a land of chaos. Now, I know that, you know, I don't think historically people were just getting shot in the streets and they were just shooting each other for looking at each other in an angry way. But yeah, you know, definitely it is that a lot of the, like I said, the frontiersmanship, the frontiersman spirit, that's kind of what I feel the film really laments. It's kind of the end of that. But yeah, I think though eventually though civilization does have to come, and the burning question is, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and it's kind of like the John Wayne archetype is in his own right the sort of the warrior, but he's like attached to things. He actually has something to defend. Well, and even in True Grit, it's like he's got to drag this like mouthy young woman along with him who hates his guts and is always complaining about him. He's always got he's always got something which compromises him, with like in True Grit, or his sons or something like that. It's like the townspeople. So he is there, but he's there as the protector against the predators of Once Upon a Time in the West.
Mm-hmm. I hinted at this earlier that there's a lot of parallels between Once Upon a Time in the West and the game Red Dead Redemption. Have you ever played that game?
No, I'm a bit past video games.
Yeah, I don't play games much anymore, but it was definitely, I think it was probably my favorite game I played when I was a teenager. A lot of the themes are very similar. It is also like the end of the West. That is the theme of the game, which whereas Once Upon a Time in the West takes place at the beginning of the end. So I think it's like the late 1860s, early 1870s, like just after the Civil War, when the railroad is just arriving, when the railroad has just about reached California. It's just coming through the West right now. Whereas in Red Dead Redemption, it's the very end of the West. So it takes place in 1911. There's already automobiles in these towns, and there's already semi-automatic handguns. There's already banks, and the railroads are going everywhere. And the plot of the game is that John Marston, the protagonist, he was a former outlaw. He was a former bandit who went straight, but then so he quit banditry and started a family after his gang had betrayed him after a failed robbery and left him for dead. And the FBI, so the new modern law enforcement, because the game does have like the old style sheriff still in the small towns, but they have the modern police forces, the FBI. What they do is they kidnap John Marston's family, and they force him to go off and kill his former gang mates. So the leaders of his former gang, John has to go and hunt them down and kill them, or bring them in as hostage in order so the FBI will free his family. And I thought that game had a lot of reactionary themes. I thought that the messages actually were quite healthy in that one, because ultimately John Marston does actually start a family toward the end of the game, and he tries to actually settle down and have a ranch as a rancher and start to have like a normal constructive and ordered life. Unfortunately, though, toward the end of the game, after you've killed the entire gang, the FBI comes and they kill John. So so the West truly does end at the end of Red Dead Redemption. But I do find that game definitely touched on a lot of the same themes. It definitely touched on, the corruption that comes in with capitalism, with the bureaucracy, with the new modern police force. Because there's like a sheriff in the game who's like a good old John Wayne like traditional sheriff, but then the FBI agent, he's like the main villain. He's portrayed as like just this scumbag, really. So a lot of interesting themes in that game as well.
Well, it's one of the earlier YouTube videos I did was an analysis of Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which is still, if you scroll back far enough or just do it on the search bar, you'll see my take on that. Another Western that I love. And it's actually, it just popped in my brain there. But it is similar to this, what we're talking about here, because the take on that was that you've got Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. It's like, I'm talking about Sam Peckinpah's movie, which is great. And what it is Peckinpah, and they're like in an outlaw gang, but Pat Garrett actually gets paid by the like a huge landowner to hunt down Billy the Kid. But the way, again, it's got this, it's more of a poetic, nostalgic, or than it's got a different feel to Leone's. It's not as grandiose as Leone's. It's got more of a sort of hippie-ish feel to it. You know, it's Chris Christopherson.
It's Bob Dylan music.
Yeah, it's Bob Dylan music. So you do have this kind of boomerish feel to it. And who's the James Coburn as Pat Garrett. But it's a great movie because essentially it's again the theme of the modern world coming into the West, except this time it isn't really represented with there's no trains in it, but what you do see is barbed wire fences going up all over the place because people are buying off the land for cattle. And so Billy the Kid is like, this is where you get the kind of counter, the 60s sort of counter culture themes in it. But it resonates with us today as well. Like, I'll give it a pass. And Sam Peckinpah, like, he's not exactly a lefty. Cross of iron, anyone? But yeah, Sam Peckinpah is like not. He's more our guy. He's not like some hippie. But anyway, so what happens is you get this thing where Billy's being used to just roaming wild, and also the landscape's a lot more gentle. It's more prairies than the harshness of Once Upon a Time in the West. But he's used to be able to wander from town to town and all these little like sort of Mexican villages, and he's just like a cool dude. And Pat Garrett's being paid by, say, the money again to hunt him down and kill him. Well, what's when you watch it again, what you'll notice is that Pat Garrett, like, it's eaten away at his soul throughout the movie. He knows, he's aware of what he's doing because he's literally sort of tracking down and to kill not just his old friend, but also like the spirit of just roaming free under the stars. Like, he is conscious of it. And you see as the film progresses that it just sort of gnaws away at him. And at the end, he just shoots him. Like, it's this, you expect this big dramatic kind of, like in the Leone movie, where it's the face-off and the shootout at the end. And it actually isn't. Billy the Kid comes wandering out with a beer with his top off, and he just shoots him in the chest. He's not even carrying a gun, nothing. And he just sits there on a stool, like sort of stewing. And then later, basically they bump him off as well when he's an old man. But there's a part on it where, and another thing is that everybody hates Pat Garrett's guts because they know what he's about, they know what he represents, and he's dressed all in black, just like this angel of doom wandering across the West. It's really great. And in fairness, the Bob Dylan song that comes in, Knocking on Heaven's Door, when like the fat old Slim Pickens, I think it is, gets gut shot and he slowly watches the sun go down as he dies. It's good stuff. It's great stuff. I mean, I don't think it's on a par with Once Upon a Time, which is a lot more raw, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's another good one. I know it is a bit of a romanticism of Billy the Kid. I think Billy the Kid actually only killed like 2 or 3 men his entire life. But yeah, I mean, I guess though, because historically that actually is how Pat Garrett did kill Billy the Kid. It was, when he was groggy, waking up from sleep in the dark of the night. Pat Garrett, he just walked in to his house and Pat Garrett just shot him as he was wandering around in the dark. Which does kind of also cut the cowboy archetype down to size quite a bit too, because you think of him as this heroic guy who shoots the bad guy with like I mentioned earlier, like they have this code of honor that if they can only kill each other in a duel, that's fought fairly to prove that they're the better man. Well, in this one, he just shoots him while he while he's unprepared. Yeah, so I think that this is probably a good place to start winding down. If anyone wants any, if anyone wants to ask any questions to Morgoth or I, you can send a super chat on Entropy. The link is in the description. I guess I'll just say like what my final take on the big questions of Once Upon a Time in the West is that I hinted at this earlier, is that in order to actually stop that tide of soulless capital, soulless money, and modernity just crushing the frontiersman spirit that people like the characters in Once Upon a Time in the West had, the Franks, Cheyennes, and Harmonicas, I think that you need new frontiers. And then you need like you can't have like this Anglo-liberalism. You need a more traditional, more spiritual way of understanding of the world that values the immaterial, that sees things like the Monument Valley as inherently valuable and something that needs to be preserved to preserve the human spirit along with the creep of technology. Because I don't think we can turn back the clock, and I think that is kind of taking this into relevancy for the modern day, that is, I think, what we need really going forward.
I mean, I think I'll leave it on a sort of playful black pill where when Harmonicas is at the end of the movie and he's looking out across the workers and he's yearning to go back into the wilderness, and Jill says like, "Will you come back?" And he says, "Maybe someday," and then heads out. And it's kind of like when all of this shit collapses in on itself. Like when I'll come back after the boogaloo, because it's kind of like it's for this kind of idea, this sort of wandering free. It's for them it was like too late, but for us it's like too early. But once everything gets bad enough, maybe it will. If we can adopt the Great Reset.
We'll have rough and tumble guys like Harmonica riding through the streets of I don't know, Philadelphia or Chicago or something like that. With there's these McDonald's with these tattered rainbow flags on the ground or something. Yeah. And he's gonna just shoot, and he's gonna shoot a guy for over the last I don't know the last hatchet that's available at the hardware store.
Yeah, that's. You'll get the return of the Frank archetype when everything collapses. He can just wander around shooting people because he doesn't like the braces and the belts and stuff.
We're not advocating for any of this, guys. Just completely theoretical. But I think that's a good place to finish it. I think we did the film justice. Is there anything else last you'd like to add to that, Morgoth?
No, I mean, I would just advise, if you've sort of tuned in, you haven't watched film, and you don't know the soundtrack, which, let's be honest, probably isn't very many people, but I would just say, just go off and listen to the soundtrack if you haven't. I mean, the movie's on BitChute, by the way, but the soundtrack is just a thing of beauty.
Yeah. So we do these streams once a month now. Our first one was on Lawrence of Arabia on Morgoth's channel in October. And each month we will alternate. So next month we will be on Morgoth's channel, and then it will be on mine again in January. So stay tuned for that.
I mean, we'll talk about this on Telegram. The problem is it'll be almost Christmas time, and it's like, I know, like, the thing is, Christmas movies tend to be crap. So I may do a poll on Telegram where it'll be either some corny Christmas movie. I mean, what are we going to sit and talk about, Home Alone or something? Or like another movie that would be Dirty Harry. So I'll put a poll out. I've got a feeling I know which way that would go.
All right, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so thank you for listening, and good night to everyone.
See you later, folks.